old. You're a king, but you cannot feel the reins of your horse because your hands are dying. Underneath your polished silver gauntlets, your skin is decomposing, nerve ending by nerve ending. You're Baldwin IV, the leper king of Jerusalem, and you're staring at the horizon where a storm of dust is rising. That dust isn't weather, it is an army. 26,000 soldiers, led by the greatest conqueror of the age, are marching to burn your city to the ground. You look around you. You don't have legions, you don't have reinforcements. You have 500 knights, 500 against 26,000. By every law of war, by every calculation of logic, you're already dead. Your body is rotting, your kingdom is outnumbered 50 to 1, and your advisors are telling you to flee. But you don't flee. You tighten your grip on a sword you can barely feel, and you order the charge. This is the Battle of Montgisard, the single most impossible military victory of the Middle Ages, and the story of how a dying boy broke the spine of an empire. Before diving into these forgotten stories of survival and suffering, if you enjoy learning about the hidden truths of history, consider hitting that like button and subscribing for more content like this. And please comment below to let me know where you're listening from. I find it incredible that we're exploring these ancient stories together from different parts of the world, connected across time and space by our shared curiosity about the past. To understand the sheer insanity of what happened on that November day in 1177, we have to strip away the romantic paintings and the Hollywood movies. We need to look at the biological reality of the man at the centre of this storm. Baldwin IV was not just a king, he was a walking corpse. Leprosy in the 12th century was not merely a disease, it was a curse from God. It was a sentence of living death. It usually meant being cast out of society, forced to wear bells to warn the healthy of your approach, and waiting for your extremities to wither and fall off. But Baldwin was the king of Jerusalem. He could not be cast out, so he had to rot on the throne. Imagine the psychological toll. From the age of 9, when his tutor William of Tyre first noticed that he felt no pain when his friends dug their fingernails into his arm, Baldwin knew his time was finite. He was living on borrowed time. Every morning he woke up. His body was a little less his own. He was losing sensation in his fingers, his toes, eventually his face. The disease attacks the nerves, leaving the victim numb to injury, which leads to infection, disfigurement, and blindness. By 16, the age when most young squires are dreaming of glory and romance, Baldwin was trying to hide the fact that he was slowly disintegrating inside his royal armour. He was a teenager who knew with absolute certainty that he would never grow old, never marry, never have children to carry on his line. He was the last of his kind, a dead end, and yet this decaying boy was the only thing standing between the Christian world and total annihilation. The year 1177 was a time of terrifying transition in the Holy Land. The First Crusade was a distant memory, a story grandfathers told their grandsons. The Crusader states, those 4 fragile Christian kingdoms established along the coast of the Levant, were surrounded. For decades, the Muslim powers in the Middle East had been divided, squabbling among themselves, which allowed the Crusaders to survive. But that era of division was over. A new power had risen in the East, a man who had united Egypt and Syria into a colossal iron vice around the Kingdom of Jerusalem. His name was Salah ad-Din Yusuf ibn Ayyub, known to the West simply as Saladin. Saladin was everything Baldwin was not. He was healthy, vibrant, a seasoned politician and a brilliant general in the prime of his life. He commanded the resources of a vast empire that stretched from the Nile to the Tigris. He had money, he had manpower, and he had a holy mission to reclaim Jerusalem. In the eyes of the world, the matchup between Saladin and Baldwin was a joke. It was a lion against a lamb. It was a force of nature against a dying child. In the autumn of 1177, Saladin received intelligence that the Kingdom of Jerusalem was vulnerable. The bulk of the Crusader army was distracted in the north, fighting a pointless campaign in Syria. Jerusalem was effectively open. The gate was unlatched. Seeing the opportunity of a lifetime, Saladin mobilized. He didn't just send a raiding party, he brought the full weight of his Egyptian army. 26,000 men. This included his elite Mamluk bodyguards, thousands of light cavalry, Sudanese infantry, and a massive baggage train. It was an invasion force designed not just to defeat an army, but to erase a kingdom. As this tidal wave of steel and horses crossed the border into the Crusader territory, panic swept through the land. The smoke from burning villages began to rise into the pale blue sky. Refugees flooded the roads, clutching their children and their meagre possessions, screaming that the end of the world had arrived. There was no one to stop the invasion. The garrisons were empty, the forts were understaffed. The only military force available was the king himself, who was currently resting in the south, trying to manage his pain. When the news reached Baldwin, he faced a choice that would define his legacy. His advisors, men with decades of experience, looked at the numbers. They looked at the king's bandaged hands. They told him to retreat. They told him to hole up in the fortified city of Ascalon and wait for a miracle, or perhaps wait for the inevitable siege. To ride out against Saladin with only the royal household guard and a handful of knights was suicide. It wasn't a battle, it was an execution. But Baldwin IV possessed something that Saladin's spies could not count, and his own advisors could not understand. He had the fearlessness of the damned. When you have already lost your future, when you have already lost the sensation in your own skin, you lose the fear of death. Baldwin realized that if he hid behind the walls of Ascalon, Saladin would bypass him and march straight to Jerusalem. The holy city would fall while its king cowered in a fortress. That was unacceptable. So, the Leper King ordered his horse to be saddled. He couldn't grip the reins, so he had his grooms tie them around his wrists. He summoned every man who could hold a sword. He stripped the garrisons of the Knights Templar. He called upon the secular knights of the realm. In total, he scraped together barely 500 knights. Even if you count the infantry and the sergeants that followed, the numbers were laughable. They were riding out to meet a force 50 times their size. As they marched out of the gates of Ascalon, the sun was beating down on the desert scrub. The heat inside the chainmail would have been suffocating. Baldwin, wrapped in his robes and armour to hide his disfigurement, rode at the front. Imagine the sight for the soldiers behind him. They weren't following a demigod like Alexander the Great or a giant like Charlemagne. They were following a sick teenager who might fall off his horse if he fainted from exhaustion. Yet there was a fire in him that terrified them more than the enemy. Saladin, meanwhile, was making a mistake born of arrogance. He knew Baldwin was at Ascalon. He knew the king had a tiny force. So Saladin did what any confident conqueror would do. He ignored him. He left a small detachment to blockade Ascalon, just to keep the cripple inside, and then he turned his massive army north towards Jerusalem. He let his men disperse. They spread out across the countryside, pillaging, burning and looting. They were relaxed. They were confident. They thought the war was already won. They thought God had already given them the city. They were wrong. Baldwin broke out of Ascalon. He evaded the blockade. And then he did the unthinkable. Instead of running away, he chased the giant. He led his 500 knights up the coast, riding hard, pushing their horses to the breaking point, chasing the dust cloud of Saladin's army. They were riding into the mouth of the beast. They were riding towards a place called Montgisar. And as the sun began to dip in the afternoon sky, on November 25th, the stage was set for a collision that would shake the foundations of history. If Baldwin IV was the dying light of the Christian world, then Saladin was the rising sun of the Islamic East. To truly grasp the impossibility of Montgisar, we cannot just look at Saladin as a villain in a storybook. We must see him as his contemporaries saw him, a titan. By 1177, Salah ad-Din was 40 years old. He was in the absolute prime of his physical and mental faculties. He was not merely a warlord. He was a statesman of genius-level intellect who had achieved what decades of Muslim leaders before him had failed to do. He had encircled the Crusaders. Look at the map of the Middle East in your mind's eye during this period. For nearly 80 years, the Crusader states had survived because the Islamic world was fractured. Damascus fought against Cairo. Aleppo fought against Mosul. The Christians played these rival cities against each other, surviving in the cracks of chaos. But Saladin ended the chaos. He conquered Egypt first, seizing the wealth of the Nile. Then he took Syria. Suddenly, the Kingdom of Jerusalem was no longer a neighbour to squabbling tribes. It was an island in a sea of green. To the south, Saladin's Egypt. To the east and north, Saladin's Syria. The noose had been tightened. All that remained was to kick away the chair, and the army he brought to kick away that chair was a masterpiece of logistical terror. 26,000 men. In the modern world, where we're used to hearing about armies of millions in World War II, 26,000 might sound modest. But in the 12th century, in the logistical nightmare of the Levant desert, moving 26,000 men and thousands of horses was akin to moving a small city. This was not a ragtag militia. This was a professional multinational force funded by the endless gold reserves of Egypt. At the core of this army were the Mamluks. We need to talk about the Mamluks because they are crucial to understanding the tactical mismatch of this battle. These were slave soldiers, purchased as young boys from the Turkic steppes, converted to Islam, and trained for one single purpose: war. They were elite horse archers, capable of firing deadly accurate arrows while riding at a full gallop. They were disciplined, armoured, and fiercely loyal to Saladin. Surrounding them were thousands of light cavalry from the desert tribes, men who moved like the wind and struck like vipers, and behind them marched the Sudanese infantry, heavy shock troops known for their resilience. Imagine standing on a ridge and watching this army move. It would have stretched for miles. The sound alone would have been physically painful. The thunder of nearly 30,000 hooves, the clanking of steel, the roar of camels carrying water and siege engines. This was an extinction event on the march. But Saladin's greatest weapon in 1177 was not his Mamluks or his gold, it was his confidence. And this is where the tragedy of his mistake begins. Saladin was a man of logic. He looked at the reports from his spies in Jerusalem. What did he see? He saw a kingdom on the verge of civil war. He saw barons arguing over succession, and primarily he saw a 16-year-old boy rotting alive on the throne. To Saladin, Baldwin IV was a tragic footnote. In the Islamic worldview of the time, health and physical perfection were often seen as signs of God's favour. A leper king was an abomination, a sign that God had already abandoned the Franks. Saladin didn't hate Baldwin. He likely pitied him. He didn't see a rival. He saw a corpse that hadn't stopped breathing yet. This psychological underestimation is the key. When Saladin crossed the border near the fort of Ascalon, he wasn't preparing for a desperate fight for survival. He was preparing for a victory lap. This arrogance bled down from the Sultan to the lowest foot soldier. The discipline of the Ayyubid army, usually ironclad, began to loosen the moment they realised no one was coming to stop them. As they bypassed Ascalon, Saladin made a fatal decision. He assumed Baldwin, trapped inside the city with his tiny force, was neutralised. He assumed the cripple would stay behind the walls, grateful just to survive another day. So, Saladin broke the cardinal rule of warfare: never leave an enemy force behind you, no matter how small. He turned his eyes to Jerusalem. The holy city was virtually undefended. The prize he had dreamed of for years was sitting there, waiting to be plucked. The order was given to disperse. The army spread out across the fertile plains of Ramla and Lydda. They weren't marching in battle formation anymore. They were foraging. Soldiers broke off to raid villages, to steal cattle, to burn crops. The tight, deadly fist of the Ayyubid army opened up into a loose, lazy hand. The smoke from the burning villages drifted towards Ascalon, taunting the men inside. Saladin was essentially saying, "I don't even need to fight you. I will burn your country around you while you watch." It was the ultimate insult. But while Saladin was looking at the horizon, dreaming of his entry into Jerusalem, he failed to look back. He failed to understand the psychology of the young man he had dismissed. He didn't understand that for Baldwin, pain was a daily companion, not a deterrent. He didn't understand that a man with no future has nothing to lose. While the Egyptian army grew fat and slow on plunder, believing the war was won and the gates of Ascalon were quietly opening. The leper king was not cowering, he was mounting up. And he was bringing the wrath of God with him. To truly appreciate the gamble Baldwin was about to take, we have to understand just how empty the kingdom of Jerusalem was in November 1177. It wasn't just that Saladin had a large army, it was that the Crusaders effectively had no army. Historical context is often dry, but here it is terrifying. Weeks before Saladin invaded, the bulk of the Crusader military strength, the famous barons, the heavy infantry, the vast majority of the Knights Templar and Hospitaller had marched north to Syria. They were chasing rumours, trying to block Saladin's movements in the north, completely misreading the Sultan's strategy. They had left the back door wide open, and Saladin crossed into the kingdom from the south. He wasn't entering a fortress, he was walking into an empty house. Baldwin IV had rushed to the city of Ascalon with whatever scraps of manpower he could find. Ascalon was a vital strategic point, known as the Bride of Syria, a massive coastal fortress that acted as the gateway to Egypt. If you control Ascalon, you control the road. But once Baldwin got inside, the trap snapped shut. Saladin, showing his tactical brilliance, didn't stop to besiege the city. He knew sieges were long, costly and boring. Instead, he detached a small blocking force, just enough men to surround the gates and keep the Christians pinned down, and then he kept moving. Picture the situation inside the walls of Ascalon. It is a claustrophobic nightmare. You have 500 knights and perhaps a few thousand infantry packed into the city. The streets are crowded, the heat is intensifying, and the morale is rock bottom. These men aren't stupid. They can climb the ramparts and look out. They can see the Muslim blocking force sharpening their scimitars just outside arrow range. But worse, they can look past them. In the distance, rising from the villages of the plain, were columns of black smoke. Saladin's army was burning the kingdom, farm by farm, village by village. Every plume of smoke represented a massacre. Every hour that passed meant another town erased. The soldiers inside Ascalon were natives of this land. That smoke was coming from their homes, their families, and they were trapped behind stone walls, forced to watch it happen because their king was a cripple and their numbers were too few. The tension in the war room must have been suffocating. The medieval chronicles give us glimpses of the arguments. The prudent move, the sane move, was to stay put. Ascalon was virtually impregnable. They had water, they had food, they could wait. Eventually the main Crusader army in the north would realise their mistake and march south. It might take weeks, but they would come. Jerusalem might be sacked in the meantime, the Holy Sepulchre might be defiled, but the state would survive. The king would survive. But Baldwin IV operated on a different frequency. We have to remember, this is a 16-year-old boy who has been told his entire life that he is cursed by God. Leprosy was seen as a divine punishment, yet Baldwin believed he was the anointed king of Jerusalem. He had a desperate, almost fanatical need to prove that despite his rotting flesh, his soul was worthy of the crown. He could not sit in a tower while his people were slaughtered. He could not let Saladin walk into Jerusalem unopposed. There is a specific kind of courage that comes from having an expiration date. Baldwin looked at his bandaged hands. Then he looked at his terrified commanders. He knew that leaving the walls meant almost certain death. If they marched out, they would be fighting on open ground where Saladin's numbers would swallow them whole. 500 knights against 26,000. In the open desert, that's not a battle. It's a feeding frenzy. Yet, Baldwin saw the one thing Saladin had missed. The blocking force outside Ascalon was too small. Saladin had been so arrogant, so sure that the leper king was helpless, that he hadn't left enough men to truly seal the city. He had left a screen, not a wall. On the morning of November 25th, Baldwin made the call. He didn't order a defence. He ordered a breakout. The gates of Ascalon swung open. The blocking force of Saladin, likely expecting the Christians to stay cowered inside, was caught off guard. The Crusaders didn't just poke their heads out, they erupted. They smashed through the thin line of Muslim besiegers, cutting them down before they could organise. But the breakout was the easy part. The hard part was what came next. Once they were free of the city, they were alone in the desert. No supply lines, no reinforcements, just a small column of metal and flesh moving north along the coast. To their right, the burning interior of the country. To their left, the endless blue of the Mediterranean Sea. They were marching effectively into the rear of Saladin's colossal army. This was the moment the Kingdom of Sand became a reality. They were no longer fighting for territory. They were fighting for existence. Every step the horses took kicked up dust, a signal to the enemy that they were coming, but the enemy was too busy looting to notice. Baldwin pushed the pace. He knew he couldn't outmuscle Saladin, but he might be able to outrun his own fate. He ordered the army to ride hard towards Ramla, towards the heart of the enemy infestation. He was gambling everything on the element of surprise, the hope that Saladin simply could not conceive of a dying boy having the audacity to hunt a lion. As the dust of the breakout settled and the walls of Ascalon faded behind them, the reality of the situation began to set in for the 500 knights. They were now exposed. There were no walls to hide behind, only the open coastal road stretching north. To understand why these men didn't simply turn around and flee, you have to understand what, or who, was riding with them. They were not just carrying swords and lances, they were carrying the physical manifestation of God. Riding alongside the king was the Bishop of Bethlehem, and in his hands was the true cross. To the modern mind, this is just a piece of wood encased in gold and jewels. But to a knight in the 12th century, this was the nuclear option of spiritual warfare. They believed this was the actual timber upon which Jesus Christ had died. Its presence meant that God was not watching from heaven, he was marching in the vanguard. It turned a suicide mission into a holy pilgrimage. If they died protecting the cross, their salvation was guaranteed. This relic acted as a psychological adrenaline shot, suppressing the natural instinct of fear that should have paralyzed them. But while the army had the true cross to lift their spirits, Baldwin had only his disintegrating body to carry him. Let's toggle the camera to the micro view inside the armour of the king. Riding a warhorse is an incredibly physical act. It requires core strength, balance, and the constant manipulation of reins. For a healthy man, a forced march under the desert sun is exhausting. For Baldwin, it was torture. By this stage of his disease, the leprosy had likely deadened the nerves in his hands and feet, but that numbness is a double-edged sword. You cannot feel the reins digging into your palms, so you don't know if you're gripping them tight enough until they slip. You cannot feel the stirrups, so your balance is compromised. To compensate, Baldwin had to use his entire body, locking his thighs against the saddle until his muscles screamed. Beneath the heavy layers of silk and chainmail, the heat would have been unbearable, turning his bandages into a stifling, sweaty prison. The friction of the armour against his lesions would have caused bleeding that he couldn't even feel. He was literally bleeding into his boots, riding through a haze of heat-stroke and exhaustion, fueled only by a willpower that terrified his own doctors. Supporting this fragile king was a backbone of steel, the Knights Templar. We must introduce Odo de Saint-Amand, the Grand Master of the Templars. If Baldwin was the spirit of the army, Odo was its fist. The Templars were the special forces of the Crusades, warrior monks who had sworn vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience. They were forbidden to retreat unless outnumbered 3-1. Here they were outnumbered 50-1, yet Odo did not flinch. He was a hard, uncompromising man, often criticised for his arrogance. But in this moment, his fanaticism was exactly what Baldwin needed. He rallied the 80 Templar Knights in the column, forming an elite vanguard around the king and the cross. Together, this strange coalition, the dying boy, the fanatic monk, and the holy relic, moved north with terrifying speed. They were ghost riders. Saladin's scouts had lost track of them. The Sultan, still confident in his slow, winding march towards Jerusalem, had no idea that the cripple he left behind was now closing the distance at a gallop. The geography of the Holy Land funneled them together. Saladin was moving his massive army across the Wadi, a dry riverbed near the hill of Montgisar Tel El Jezer. It was a choke point. The Ayyubid army was struggling with its own weight. The baggage train was slow, the herds of stolen cattle were blocking the roads, the soldiers were tired from days of raiding. They were essentially a traffic jam armed with swords. As Baldwin's force approached the region of Montgizar, the sun was beginning to cast long shadows. The element of surprise was absolute. The wind was blowing from the north, carrying the dust of Saladin's army into the faces of the Crusaders. They could taste the enemy before they saw them. Suddenly the scouts returned to Baldwin. The report was breathless. The enemy was just ahead. Not a patrol, not a rearguard, but the entire host. They were disorganised, crossing the stream, their armour packed away in wagons due to the heat, their horses unmounted. Baldwin stopped his horse. He looked at his 500 knights. They were caked in dust, their horses foaming with sweat. Ahead of them lay an ocean of enemies. This was the moment. There was no time for a council of war. There was no time for complex tactics. There was only the shock of contact. The king dismounted. This was a struggle for him, his limbs stiff and unresponsive. He fell to his knees in the sand in front of the true cross. The entire army went silent. The only sound was the wind and the distant murmur of the oblivious enemy. Baldwin prayed aloud, his voice cracking with emotion and pain. He wept. Seeing their king, this boy who should have been in a hospital bed, weeping into the dirt and begging God for victory, the hardened knights began to weep with him. It wasn't a cry of despair, it was a release of tension, a collective acceptance of their fate. Then Baldwin stood up. The tears were gone. He signalled for his grooms to help him back into the saddle. He didn't need to say a word. The look in his eyes said it all. Strike. Let's shift the camera to the other side of the hill. Let's inhabit the mind of a soldier in Saladin's army for a moment. You are confident. You are relaxed. You are part of the largest military force the region has seen in decades. You have spent the last few days burning villages, and your saddlebags are heavy with loot. The fear of the Franks has evaporated. You know their king is a cripple trapped in Ascalon. You know their army is lost in the north. The war is practically over before it began. Saladin's army was moving across the undulating plains near Montgizar. Because of their sheer numbers and their confidence, discipline had evaporated. The historical sources tell us the army was strung out over miles. The baggage train, thousands of camels carrying tents, water and stolen goods, was clogging the roads. Many soldiers had dismounted to rest or water their horses at the stream. Some had even taken off their heavy armour to escape the stifling afternoon heat. Saladin himself was likely overseeing the crossing of the Wadi, perhaps discussing the final approach to Jerusalem with his generals. Then the ground began to tremble. At first it might have felt like a minor earthquake, common enough in the Jordan Rift Valley. But the vibration became rhythmic. A low, dull, thrumming sound began to rise from the south. Distinct from the wind, seasoned veterans would have recognized it instantly, but their brains would have rejected the information. It was the sound of a heavy cavalry charge, but that was impossible. There was no army behind them. Then they saw it. Rising out of the heat haze and the dust, the banners of the Kingdom of Jerusalem appeared, the gold crosses on white fields, the black and white standard of the Templars. And in the centre, shimmering like a mirage, the Great Cross. Panic is a contagion. In an ancient army it spreads faster than fire. The soldiers nearest the rear saw the wall of steel approaching and shouted the alarm, but it was too late to form a battle line. The Ayyubid army was caught in the worst possible tactical position, in column of march. They were a long snake, vulnerable on the sides, unable to turn and fight. Baldwin didn't hesitate. He didn't stop to parley. He didn't offer terms. He unleashed the charge. To understand why 500 men could shatter 26,000, you have to understand the physics of the Frankish knight. In the 12th century, a charging knight was the equivalent of a kinetic missile. The knight, the horse and the armour combined to weigh over 1,000 pounds. They rode with long, heavy ash lances tucked tight under their arms, a technique called couching. When they hit a target, the force wasn't just the strength of the man's arm, It was the entire momentum of the galloping horse concentrated into a steel tip the size of a coin. The Crusaders slammed into the disorganized flank of Saladin's army like a sledgehammer hitting a pane of glass. The sound of the impact would have been sickening. The crack of lances shattering, the crunch of bone, the screams of horses. The Ayyubid light cavalry, caught unarmoured and unmounted, didn't stand a chance. They were vaporized on contact. The Crusader wedge drove deep into the enemy mass, cutting a path of red ruin. Leading the charge, incredibly, was Baldwin. The king, with no feeling in his hands, was riding knee to knee with the Templars. We can assume his horse was guided by seasoned squires or that he was strapped into the saddle, but his presence at the tip of the spear sent a shockwave through his own men. They weren't fighting for a distant monarch. They were fighting for the boy who was bleeding beside them. They fought with a ferocity that the Muslim chroniclers later described as demonic. Odo de Saint Amand and his 80 Templars acted as a chainsaw. They didn't scramble, they stayed in formation, a tight, disciplined block of death that chewed through everything in its path. Their target was clear. They weren't interested in the foot soldiers. They weren't interested in the loot. They were looking for the yellow banners of the Sultan's personal guard. They were headhunting. Saladin, caught near the centre of his sprawling army, watched in horror as his flank disintegrated. He tried to rally his Mamluks. These were his elite, the best warriors in the east. They managed to scramble onto their horses and form a desperate defensive ring around the Sultan. But the momentum was entirely with the Crusaders. The geography turned against Saladin. The baggage train that had made his army so comfortable now became a death trap. The carts and camels blocked the retreat, causing the panicked soldiers to trip over each other. The narrow crossing of the Wadi became a bottleneck of crushed bodies. The miracle of Montgassar was not magic. It was the perfect storm of tactical surprise, terrain, and the terrifying application of shock warfare. The Crusaders knew they had only one chance. If they stopped moving, if they got bogged down in a melee, the sheer weight of Saladin's numbers would crush them. So they kept moving. They kept charging. They cut through the army like a hot knife through butter, driving deeper and deeper toward the heart of the enemy command. For Saladin, the world had turned upside down in the span of 20 minutes. The hunter had become the prey. He saw the white mantles of the Templars breaking through his final line of defense. He saw the Leper King, face hidden behind a mask or bandages, sword raised, coming for him. The man who wanted to conquer Jerusalem was now suddenly fighting just to survive the next 10 seconds. The initial impact was the hammer blow, but battles are not won by the first strike alone. They are won in the chaotic, bloody grinding that follows. As the dust settled over the valley of Tel el-Jeza, the biblical site of Gaza, the true scale of the slaughter became visible. This wasn't a battle anymore. It was a prison riot. The mist of Montgassard wasn't just atmospheric. It was a blinding cocktail of sand, sweat and blood that enveloped the combatants. Inside this cloud, the numerical advantage of Saladin's army vanished. In close quarters, a 26,000-man army that cannot maneuver is just a 26,000-man traffic jam. The Crusaders, outnumbered but mounted on heavy warhorses, acted like wolves in a sheep pen. But there was one group that did not panic. The Mamluk Imperial Guard. These were men who had been raised from childhood to die for their sultan. While the peasant conscripts and light cavalry fled into the twilight, the Mamluks held their ground. They formed a yellow wall of steel around Saladin's tent. This was the hardest fighting of the day. The Templars, led by Odo de Saint Amand, smashed into this wall again and again. It was heavy cavalry against heavy cavalry, a grinding contest of strength where lances were useless and swords were drawn. In the centre of this maelstrom was Baldwin IV, and this is where the story transcends military history and enters the realm of the impossible. By all medical logic, Baldwin should have collapsed from heat stroke within the first 10 minutes. His body had no mechanism to regulate temperature effectively. His skin was fragile, yet chronicles suggest he was there, in the thick of it. Imagine the micro view again. The king is strapped to his saddle. He's surrounded by chaos. Arrows are pinging off his armour. The smell must have been atrocious. Bowels loosening and death, iron and sulphur. But the Leper King did not fall. His presence acted as a totem. Every time a Crusader knight looked up and saw the golden helmet of the king still upright, still moving forward, they found a fresh reserve of strength. If the dying boy could fight, they had no excuse to tire. The target was Saladin. The Crusaders were close, terrifyingly close. They were so close that they nearly captured the Sultan's baggage train, capturing his personal belongings. For Saladin, the psychological shock was total. He watched his nephew, a brilliant young commander named Taqi al-Din, fighting desperately to buy him time. He watched his grandnephew, the son of his brother, cut down before his eyes. The invincibility of the Ayyubid dynasty was being dismantled by a cripple. The moment the Mamluk line finally broke is one of the most dramatic scenes in medieval history. It wasn't a tactical retreat. It was a collapse. The Mamluks, seeing that the battle was lost and their sultan was seconds away from capture or death, made the ultimate sacrifice. They threw themselves at the Templar horses, dying in droves to create a gap for Saladin to escape. And escape he did, but not as a conqueror. The great Saladin, the Eagle of Egypt, the man who would later be hailed as the epitome of chivalry, was forced to flee like a common thief. He didn't ride out on his magnificent war horse. In the panic, he was forced to jump onto a racing camel, a lighter, faster beast designed for speed, not war. Visualizing this is crucial. The most powerful man in the Middle East, stripped of his dignity, whipping a camel through the darkening desert, leaving his army to be butchered behind him. He fled into the night with only a handful of guards. He didn't stop for water. He didn't stop to rally his troops. He ran. Behind him, the mist of Montgisard turned red. With the Sultan gone, the remaining 20-odd thousand soldiers lost all will to fight. The battle dissolved into a rout. And in ancient warfare, the rout is where the real killing happens. The Crusaders, despite their exhaustion, chased them. They chased them for 12 miles until night fell. The sun went down on a landscape of utter devastation. The invincible army of Egypt was scattered to the winds. The baggage train, laden with the wealth intended to rebuild Jerusalem as an Islamic capital, was now in the hands of the Franks. Baldwin IV halted his horse. He was likely barely conscious. His bandages would have been soaked through. He had done the impossible. He had led 500 men into the jaws of death and broken the teeth of the beast. But as the adrenaline faded, the pain would have returned with a vengeance. The king had won the battle, but the war against his own body was far from over. History often focuses on the clash of steel, but at Montgisard the true slaughter began after the swords were sheathed. As the sun set on that November evening, the adrenaline that had sustained both armies began to fade, replaced by a new, terrifying reality. The Battle of Montgisard was not just won by Baldwin IV, it was sealed by the weather, in a twist of fate that the Christian chroniclers immediately ascribed to divine intervention. The skies opened up. The Levant is known for its heat, but the winters can be brutal, bringing freezing rains and biting winds that cut through bone. As Saladin's broken army scattered into the desert, a torrential storm descended. This was the iron hammer that shattered what little remained of the Ayyubid discipline. Imagine the plight of a fleeing Egyptian soldier. You have thrown away your armour to run faster. You're dehydrated from the battle. You have no food, no water skins, and no map. You're running blindly south towards the safety of Egypt, which is hundreds of miles away across one of the most inhospitable landscapes on Earth, the Sinai Peninsula, and now the temperature drops. The rain turns the dust into a freezing slurry of mud. For the next 10 days, the retreat of Saladin became a death march. The contemporary accounts paint a picture of apocalyptic misery. The Bedouin tribes, who had previously been paid off by Saladin or intimidated by his power, smelled blood. Seeing the Sultan's army broken and vulnerable, they turned on them. They emerged from the dunes to harass the stragglers, stripping the dead and dying of their clothes, leaving them naked in the freezing rain. Saladin himself, the man who commanded empires, was reduced to a fugitive fighting the elements. He rode his racing camel into the ground. He had no royal tent, no servants, no hot meals. He drank muddy water from puddles. He watched his closest companions die of exposure or thirst. It is said that during this retreat, Saladin was so exhausted and so fearful of capture that he barely spoke. The eagle of Egypt had been plucked. The numbers are staggering. Historical estimates suggest that out of the 26,000 men who marched confidently into Palestine, barely 10% made it back to Egypt. Think about that statistic. Over 20,000 men did not die in combat. They died in the chaos of the rout and the cruelty of the retreat. They died of hypothermia in the desert. They died of thirst. They died alone, buried in the shifting sands of the Sinai. Back in Cairo, the news of the disaster arrived before the Sultan. The city went into mourning. The rumour on the street was that Saladin was dead. When he finally arrived, haggard and ghost-like, he was a changed man. He had lost his army, his baggage train, and his aura of invincibility. He wrote to his brother later, describing the battle and the retreat, "We have fallen into a distress that only God can relieve." It was a confession of total defeat. But while Saladin was enduring his long walk of shame, the scene in Jerusalem was one of delirious, almost hysterical joy. Baldwin IV returned to the Holy City not as a leper but as a saviour. He had achieved what the great kings of Europe would fail to do in later crusades. He had destroyed the main field army of the Islamic world with a handful of knights. As he rode through the gates of Jerusalem, the bells of the Church of the Holy Sepulchre were ringing. The people thronged the streets trying to touch the hem of his robe. They didn't see the bandages, they saw the victory. They didn't see the rotting flesh, they saw the hand of God. However, the camera must now zoom in on the king himself. The adrenaline dump after such a battle is physically devastating for a healthy man. For Baldwin, it was catastrophic. He had pushed his body far beyond its biological limits. The friction of the ride, the stress of the command, the exposure to the elements, it all exacted a terrible price. When the armour was finally peeled off his body in the privacy of his chambers, the reality was grim. The exertion had accelerated his disease. The lesions were worse. The numbness was spreading. Baldwin had traded his life force for this victory. He had bought his kingdom time, perhaps a year, perhaps 2, but he had spent the last of his own vitality to do it. This is the tragic irony of Montgisart. It was the high water mark of the Latin kingdom of Jerusalem, the moment of its greatest triumph. But it was also the beginning of the end for its greatest hero. Baldwin had proven that sheer will could overcome impossible odds, but he could not defeat the biology that was eating him from the inside out. The victory at Montgisart sent shockwaves through the medieval world. In the courts of Europe, in Paris, in London, in Rome, the story of the Leper King's miracle was told and retold. It gave the West a false sense of security. They believed that God was protecting Jerusalem, that the kingdom was safe. They didn't realize that the kingdom was held together by the willpower of a single dying boy. And they didn't realize that Saladin, humiliated and enraged, was not the type of man to forget. He was back in Egypt, rebuilding, retraining, and swearing a blood oath that he would never, ever underestimate the Leper King again. The storm had passed, but the long shadow of the future was already creeping over the walls of Jerusalem. Montgisart was a miracle, but miracles are rarely repeatable. In the years following 1177, the adrenaline faded and the biological bill came due. The Leper King had spent his life force on the sands of Montgisart, and now his body began to shut down completely. To understand the tragedy of the Kingdom of Jerusalem, you have to watch the slow, agonizing decay of its saviour. The disease was relentless. By his early 20s, Baldwin was blind. The bacteria had destroyed the nerves in his eyes. His hands and feet, already damaged, became useless stumps. He could no longer hold a sword. He could no longer mount a horse. The golden mask that pop culture loves to depict him wearing wasn't just for aesthetics. It was likely hiding a face that was collapsing in on itself. Yet, and this is the part that defies belief, he continued to rule. He continued to lead. Saladin, back in Egypt, had learned his lesson. Montgisart had traumatized him. He realized that as long as Baldwin breathed, the kingdom had a spiritual iron dome protecting it. So, the Sultan changed his strategy. He stopped trying to crush the Crusaders in a single pitched battle. Instead, he waited. He became the vulture, circling, waiting for the lion to finally die. He rebuilt his army, this time with even more discipline, and he probed the borders, testing the resolve of the Christian lords. But even a dying lion can bite. There is a moment in 1183, 6 years after Montgisart, that captures the essence of this era. Saladin besieged the castle of Kerak. The Crusader army immobilized to lift the siege, but their king could not ride. Did he stay behind? No. Baldwin ordered his servants to carry him on a litter, a stretcher slung between two horses. Imagine the sight. The king of Jerusalem, blind, crippled, unable to stand, being carried into the war zone like a holy relic. And the most incredible part, it worked. When Saladin heard that Baldwin was personally present with the army, even lying on a stretcher, he withdrew, he retreated. The mere presence of the Leper King was enough to check the greatest conqueror of the East. Saladin feared the spirit of the man, even if he no longer feared his body. But while Baldwin held the line against Saladin, he could not hold the line against the enemies within his own court. This is where the story shifts from an epic war movie to a political tragedy. As Baldwin weakened, the vultures began to circle inside Jerusalem. The court was filled with ambitious, incompetent men who looked at the dying king not with pity but with impatience. They were waiting for him to die so they could seize power. Men like Guy of Lusignan and Reynaud of Châtillon began to assert themselves. These were men who had none of Baldwin's wisdom, none of his patience, and certainly none of his tactical genius. They were reckless. They provoked Saladin. They broke truces. They raided Muslim caravans just for the gold, ignoring the fragile geopolitical balance Baldwin had sacrificed his life to maintain. Baldwin, trapped in his dark, silent world of blindness and pain, tried to control them. He tried to arrange a succession that would save the kingdom. He tried to appoint capable regents, but his body failed him. He was losing his grip on the reins of state just as he had lost his grip on the reins of his horse. The tragedy of Montgisart is that it bought the kingdom time, but the kingdom wasted it. Instead of fortifying their position, the Crusader barons spent the precious years squabbling over who would be king next. They didn't realise that the crown they were fighting for was about to become a crown of thorns. In 1185, at the age of just 24, Baldwin IV finally succumbed to his disease. The Leper King was dead. The iron wall that had held back the tide of Islam for a decade had crumbled. When the news reached Damascus, Saladin reportedly did not celebrate. There was no dancing in the streets. He sat in solemn silence. He respected Baldwin more than any of the healthy knights who were now scrambling for the throne. He knew that with Baldwin gone, the soul of the kingdom had departed. The game was now fair. And in a fair fight, Saladin knew he would not lose again. The stage was set for the catastrophe. The miracle of 1177 was over. The nightmare of 1187 was about to begin. 2 years. That is how long the kingdom of Jerusalem survived without its leper king. When Baldwin IV died in 1185, the crown passed to a succession of figures who possessed healthy bodies but decaying minds. The worst of them was Guy of Lusignan, a handsome, vacuous nobleman who looked every inch a king but thought like a novice. Beside him was Reynaud of Châtillon, a brutal warlord who treated treaties like toilet paper. Together, these two men managed to undo in 24 months what Baldwin had preserved for a decade. In July 1187, Saladin returned. But this time, he wasn't facing a strategic genius. He was facing fools. Saladin laid a trap at the city of Tiberias. It was bait. He wanted the Crusader army to leave their springs, leave their fortifications, and march across the arid plateau of Galilee in the height of summer. It was the exact same scenario as Montgisart, but with one crucial difference: the leadership. Baldwin, at Montgisart, had moved with lightning speed to catch Saladin off guard. Guy of Lusignan, however, moved with agonizing slowness. He marched the entire strength of the kingdom, the largest army Jerusalem had ever assembled, far bigger than Baldwin's force, into a waterless wasteland. The Battle of Hattin was the anti-Montgisard. It was a masterclass in how not to fight Saladin. The Crusaders were surrounded, not by a mist of their own making, but by smoke from brush fires lit by Saladin's men to choke them. They were dying of thirst before the first sword was swung. When the end came, it was total. The king, Guy of Lusignan, was captured. The reckless Renaud of Châtillon was executed by Saladin himself. The Templars and Hospitallers were rounded up and beheaded en masse, but the greatest loss was not the men, it was the symbol. Remember the true cross, the relic that the Bishop of Bethlehem had carried at Montgisard? The relic that had emboldened 500 knights to charge 26,000. At Hattin, it was captured. Saladin ordered it to be paraded upside down through the streets of Damascus. For the Christian world, this was a psychological blow heavier than the loss of any city. It was as if God himself had been taken prisoner. Weeks later, Saladin arrived at the gates of Jerusalem. There was no Baldwin IV on the ramparts to defy him. There was no miracle coming over the horizon. The city surrendered on October 2nd, 1187. As Saladin rode into the holy city, the contrast with the Crusaders' conquest 88 years earlier was stark. He did not massacre the population. He allowed those who could pay a ransom to leave. He purified the Al-Aqsa Mosque with rosewater. He was the magnanimous victor, the chivalrous sultan. But as the refugees streamed out of Jerusalem, beginning their long walk home to Europe or the coast, the memory of Montgisard must have felt like a fever dream. How had they fallen so far, so fast? They had forgotten the lesson of the Leper King. Baldwin had taught them that survival in the East required more than just heavy armour and stone walls. It required unity, speed, and a terrifying clarity of purpose. Without him, the Crusaders became just another foreign army in a hostile land. Heavy, slow, and blind. The Battle of Montgisard faded into history. It became an inconvenient footnote. Why? Because history is written by the victors, and ultimately the Crusaders lost. It is painful to remember a miracle when you know the story ends in tragedy. It is easier to remember Richard the Lionheart, who came later to fight Saladin to a draw, than to remember the disfigured boy who actually beat him. But Saladin never forgot. Until his dying day, the only Christian leader he truly feared, the only one he spoke of with a mix of dread and respect, was not the healthy King Guy, nor the mighty Lionheart. It was the boy who had to be tied to his horse. So, why have we returned to this story? Why has a leper king from the 12th century suddenly exploded in popularity across social media, TikTok and YouTube in the 21st century? It's not just because the battle scenes are cool, it's because Baldwin IV represents the ultimate answer to a question we all face. What do I do when life treats me unfairly? We live in an era obsessed with appearance, with health, with curating the perfect image. Baldwin IV lost all of that before he hit puberty. He was dealt perhaps the worst hand in the history of kingship. A rotting body, a short life expectancy, and an enemy 20 times his size. By every metric of logic, he should have been a victim. He should have stayed in his room, complaining about the injustice of the universe. But he didn't. He put on a mask, strapped himself to a horse, and rode out to meet the impossible. The Battle of Montgisard is not just a military victory, it is a philosophical statement. It proves that the spirit can command the body, even when the body is falling apart. It proves that numerical disadvantage is irrelevant in the face of absolute conviction. Baldwin didn't defeat Saladin because he had better weapons or more men. He defeated him because he had accepted his death, and in doing so, he became unstoppable. Saladin may have eventually retaken Jerusalem. He may have won the geopolitical game in the end. But in the long narrative of history, Baldwin won the moral victory. He forced the greatest conqueror of the age to bow his head in respect to a dying boy. When we look at the 500 knights charging into the 26,000, we aren't just seeing a medieval skirmish. We are seeing a metaphor for our own lives. We all have our own Montgisard. Maybe it's a chronic illness. Maybe it's a financial crisis. Maybe it's a dream that everyone tells you is impossible. You look at the horizon and you see 26,000 reasons to give up. You see the dust rising. You feel the fear. Baldwin's legacy whispers a simple, brutal truth to us across 8 centuries. Saddle up anyway, the walls may fall, the body may fail. The kingdom may eventually crumble, but for one glorious afternoon in the desert, if you refuse to bow to the inevitable, you can make even the giants run in fear. If you found value in this story of resilience, please subscribe to the channel. We are building a library of history's most incredible forgotten moments, and I want you to be part of it. And I have a question for you to answer in the comments below. What is the Montgesard in your life right now? What is the impossible battle you're fighting? Share your story. You might find that you're not fighting it alone. For those who want to understand the man who finally defeated the Crusaders, click this video here to learn about the true genius of Saladin. Or, if you want to dive deeper into the warriors who rode with Baldwin, click here for the dark history of the Knights Templar. Until next time, remember, history isn't just about the past, it's about who we are today.